So as I suspected, as intriguing and interesting as you all were by my reading, the simple lack of technology did not allow me to read the entire story, so I'll have to begin again. I'm not sure where I had been cut off, but we will begin where I find it to be appropriate. Excuse me. Let's go on. And so when she married Elton, she did so without telling her family. She already knew their judgment of Elton. Quote, "He's nothing." She and Elton simply drove down to Hargrave one late October afternoon, awakened a preacher, and got married, hoping that their marriage would be accepted as an accomplished fact. They were wrong. It was not acceptable, and it was never going to be. She no longer belonged in that house, her parents told her. She no longer belonged to that family. To them it would be as if she had never lived. She was 17. She had attended a small denominational college for less than 2 months, and now her life, as it had been, had ended. The day would come when she would know herself to be a woman of faith. Now she merely loved and trusted. Nobody was living then on Elton's mother's little farm on Cotton Ridge, where Elton had lived for a while when he was a child. They rented the place and moved in, having just enough money to pay for the new dish cabinet and the table and 4 chairs. Elton, as it happened, already owned a milk cow in addition to his team and a few tools. It was a different world, a new world to her, that she came into then, a world of poverty and community. They were in a neighborhood of 6 households, counting their own, all within half a mile of one another. Besides themselves were Bramer and Josie Hardy and their children, Tom Hardy and his wife, also named Josie, Walter and Thelma Cotman and their daughter Irene, Jonah and Daisy Hampel and their children, Uncle Isham and Aunt Frances Quayle, who were Thelma Cotman's and Daisy Hampel's parents. The 2 Josies, to save confusion, were called Josie Bramer and Josie Tom. Josie Tom was Walter Cotman's sister, and the world that Mary Penn had given up, a place far larger and richer farms, work was sometimes exchanged, but the families were conscious of themselves in a way that set them apart from one another. Here in this world, neighbors were always working together. Many hands work light. Uncle Isham Quayle loved to say, though his own hands were no longer able to work much. Some work only the men did together, like haying and harvesting corn. Some work only the women did together, sewing or quilting or wallpapering or house cleaning. And whenever the men were all together working, the women would be together cooking. Some work the men and women did together, like harvesting tobacco or killing hogs or any other job that needed many hands. It was an old community. They all worked hard together a long time. They all knew what each other was good at. When they worked together, not much needed to be explained. When they went down to the little weather board at Gofford on Sunday morning, they were glad to see one another and had much to say, though they had seen each other almost daily during the week. This neighborhood opened to Mary and Elton and took them in with a warmth that answered her parents' rejection. The men, without asking or being asked, included Elton in whatever they were doing. They told him when and where they needed him. They came to him when he needed them. He was an apt and able hand, and they were glad to have his help. He learned from them all but liked best work with Walter Cotman, who was a fine farmer. He and Walton were, up to a point, two of a kind. Both were impatient of disorder. Quote, "I can't stand a damned mess." And Walter, and he made none, and both loved the employment of their minds in their work. They were unlike in that Walter was satisfied within the boundaries of his little farm, but Elton could not have been. Nonetheless, Elton loved his growing understanding of Walter's character and his ways. Though he was a quiet man and gave neither instruction nor advice, Walter was Elton's teacher, and Elton was consciously his student. Once, when they had killed hogs, and Elton and Mary had stayed at home to finish rendering the lard, the boiling of fat had foamed up and begun to run over the sides of the kettle. Mary ran to the house and called Walter on the parting line. "Tell him to throw the fire to it," Walter said. "Tell him to dip out some lard and throw it on the fire." Elton did so, unbelieving, but the fire flared, grew hotter, the foaming lard subsided in the kettle, and Elton's face relaxed from an anxiety of self-accusation into a grin. "Well," he said, quoting Walter in Walter's voice, "it's all in knowing how." Mary, who had more to learn than Elton, became a daughter to every woman in the community. She came knowing little, barely enough to begin, and they taught her much. Thelma, Daisy, and two Josies taught her the ways of cooking, cleaning, and sewing. They taught her to can, pickle, and preserve. They taught her to do the woman's job in the hog killing. They took her on expeditions to one another's houses to cook harvest meals, or to house clean, or to gather corn from the fields and can it. One day they all walked down to go forth to do some wallpapering for Josie Tom's mother. They papered 2 rooms, had a good time, and Josie Tom's mother fixed them a dinner of fried chicken, creamed new potatoes and peas, hot biscuits, and cherry cobbler. In cold weather, they sat all afternoon in one another's houses, quilting or sewing or embroidering. Josie Tom was the best at needlework. Everything she made was a wonder. From spring to fall, for a Christmas present for someone, she was always embroidering a long cloth that began with the earliest flowers of spring and ended with the last flowers of fall. She drew the flowers on the cloth with a pencil and worked them in with a needle and colored threads. She included the flowers of the woods and fields, the dooryards and gardens. She loved to point to the penciled outlines and name the flowers, as if calling them up in their beauty in her imagination. "Look there," she would say. "I put even a Jimson weed and a bull thistle," said Tom Hardy, who had put his doubts about weeds and thistles, but was proud of her for leaving nothing out. Excuse me. Josie Tom was a plump, pretty, happy woman, childless, but the mother of any children in reach. Mary Penn loved her the best, perhaps, but she loved them all. They were only in their late 30s or early 40s, but to Mary they seemed to belong to the ageless, eternal generation of mothers, unimaginably older and more experienced than herself. She called them Miss Josie, Miss Daisy, Miss Thelma. They warmed and sheltered her. Sometimes she could have just tossed herself at them like a little girl to be hugged. They were capable, unasking, generous, humorous women, and sometimes, among themselves, they were raucous and free, unlike the other women she had known. On the way home from picking blackberries one afternoon, they had to get through a new barbed wire fence. Josie Tom held 2 wires apart, while the other 4 gathered their skirts, leaned down, and straddled through. Josie Tom, their filled buckets over. Josie Tom handed their filled buckets over, and then Josie Bramer held the wires apart. Josie Tom, stooping through, got the back of her dress hung on the top wire. "I knew it," she said, and she began to laugh. They all laughed. Nobody laughed more than Josie Tom, who was standing, spraddled and stooped, helpless to move without tearing her dress. "Josie Bramer," she said, "are you going to just stand there, or going to unhook me from this shitten fence?" Oh, that's a bad word. And there on the ridgetop in the low sunlight, they danced the dance of women, laughing, bending, and straightening, raising, lowering their hands, swaying, and stepping with their heads back. Daylight was full in the windows now. Mary made herself get up and extinguish the lamp on the table. The lamps all needed to be cleaned and trimmed and refilled, and she had planned to do that today. The whole house needed to be dusted and swept, and she had mending to do. She tied a scarf around her head, put on her coat, and went out. Only day before yesterday it had been spring, warm, sunny, and still. Elton said the wildflowers were starting up in the leafless woods, and she found a yellow crocus in the yard, and this dry and bitter wind had come, driving down from the north as if it were as long, as wide as time, and the sky was as gray as if the sun had never shone. The wind went through her coat, pressed her fluttering skirt tight against her legs, tore at her scarf. It chilled her to the bone. She went first to the privy in the back corner of the yard, and then on to the hen house, where she shelled corn for the hens and gave them fresh water. On her way back to the house,